Here are some paintings that I've done with the watercolor brushes. There are three categories of watercolor in Painter, and I will introduce you to all of them, starting with digital watercolor. I have selected just 6 of the many variants from that category for a custom palette, and a couple of paper textures are also included, and they are both from the watercolor paper library. So let's begin with new simple water. I'll just make a stroke, and I believe you'll see a bit of the paper texture showing through the stroke. With a different color, I'll make a coarse mop brush stroke. Notice how the colors are blending, and notice also with this stroke, the edges have a very distinctive texture corresponding to the rough watercolor that we got from the Watercolor Papers library. Let's look at wash brush with another color. That is a smoother looking brush. Round water blender will be able to combine and blur and soften some of these colors and smudge them into each other. We have a fine tip water, which will give you some very thin strokes so you can do some detail work. And finally, gentle wet eraser, which can lift color, lighten an area, but you'll want to use this tool sparingly because in traditional watercolor, it's very rare to be able to actually remove all of the color and go down to the paper once again. I'm going to collapse this one here and show you watercolor. Let's take a look at watery soft bristle, and I'll stick with purple. So here's a watery soft bristle, and notice that it began as separate bristles, and then it evolved into a stroke that picks up texture inside the stroke. Let's see what happens when we drag across, and notice that we can build up color as we go over previous stroke. This is definitely something we can do with traditional watercolor. Notice also, when I used that variant, a new layer was automatically created, a watercolor layer. Watercolor must operate on a watercolor layer, while digital watercolor operates on the canvas or on any ordinary or default layer. Grainy wash bristle, let's just see what that looks like. That's very grainy, all right. And I'll just change color here while I show you wet wash flat. Flat refers to the shape of the brush. If you drag across, it will be a wider stroke, but if you go vertically, it will be a narrower stroke that appears to be depositing more color. Notice the wet edges on these strokes. They are definitely more sophisticated and complex than the variants that you had in digital watercolor. We'll look at runny wet flat, and I'll change color once again. That is certainly runny. It runs down the paper and leaves trails that are very grainy indeed. Let's take a look at eraser salt. I'm going to get little areas that seem to have been erased, and they also look like salt grains might have been involved. And this really imitates a traditional technique of actually sprinkling salt on wet paint. The salt crystals absorb the paint, leaving lighter areas in their wake. Now, I generally like to see this larger, so I'm going to make that a little bit larger and then sprinkle some more. And this looks a little more interesting than what we had before. Let's see what diffuse camel does. We haven't seen that one yet. Make that a darker color here, a nice dark red. That is giving us a series of bristles that diffuse into the paper texture. Now, delete that layer. I'm going to introduce you now to real watercolor, which also functions on a watercolor layer. So when we begin making a stroke, let's begin with fractal wash wet, and I'll choose pink. And notice the footprint of this brush is very large, and it has a really interesting rough edge to it. The stroke can be used to build up color, but notice that each stroke gets a little bit lighter after it has been deposited, and this again imitates traditional media. Let's try light bristle, and I'll change color for that one. That has lightened up as we allow it to develop. I'm just making some layering here so I can get a bit more density for the color. Melted flow map. The reason I put this into text form is because the stroke looks very much like noisy flow map, and we will be using flow maps in order to influence the look of the stroke. So melted flow map, and let's give this one a nice bright green, and I'm going to drag down a stroke, and you'll see that it also takes a while to evolve, and the edge and even the interior of the stroke is going to be influenced by the current flow map, which happens to be marbled, and we have that in our custom palette for real watercolor. Let me switch to gravel and see the difference that we can get from a stroke using that flow map. I'm going to make this a darker color because I think we can see more that way. So that was gravel. I'm going to switch to hatch. When I use that, I can clearly see a distinctive texture that is the result of my choice in the flow map library. I'll show you real wet wash. Make that a lighter blue, and so this is a smoother stroke. Let's see what wet pencil does for us. Wet pencil is a thin stroke that definitely reveals paper texture and can be used for detail work. Let's see what happens when we make a dark color for this wet pencil stroke. One more of these, splatter dry. Let me make that a green once again. That will enable us to create some very organic looking splatters that can add to the realism of your work. This is a taste of real watercolor, watercolor, and digital watercolor. There's no reason why you can't combine all three effects as long as you realize you must work on the canvas or a default layer for digital watercolor. And you can use as many watercolor layers as you wish to combine strokes from the other two categories. Now we are going to take a break here, and when we come back, we will do a project where we begin with a photo and turn it into a sketch with watercolor and ink drawings. So I'll see you in the next session, and I'll take you through this step by step.